February 8, 1945. 5 hours. Obergefreiter Hans Dietrich pressed his body against the frozen earth of his foxhole as the world around him began to disintegrate. Through the pre-dawn darkness, he heard it first, a sound like distant thunder rolling across the Reichswald Forest. Then the horizon erupted in cascading flashes of orange and white, and Dietrich realized with cold certainty that he was about to experience something no German soldier had been prepared for. 1,050 artillery tubes, British and Canadian, opened fire simultaneously. The barrage was precise, methodical, and overwhelming. Dietrich's position, carefully constructed among the pines of the Materborn Ridge, offered no protection against what was coming. The mathematics of modern Allied artillery coordination were about to rewrite the rules of defensive warfare in a language the Wehrmacht had failed to comprehend. Within 90 seconds, the first shells began falling on German forward positions. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. High explosive rounds from 105mm howitzers tore through the forest canopy. Medium guns at 155mm obliterated concrete bunkers. Heavy artillery, some pieces weighing tons, hurled shells that created craters 20 feet across. And behind this wall of fire, barely 100 yards away, a creeping barrage advanced at precisely timed intervals, walking forward like death itself, destroying everything in its predetermined path. This was not the artillery warfare Dietrich had been trained to expect. This was something fundamentally different, an industrial application of firepower so coordinated, so mathematically precise, that individual courage became irrelevant. The British and Canadians had perfected a technique first developed in the trenches of the Great War, and they were about to demonstrate that the Wehrmacht, despite all its tactical brilliance, had catastrophically underestimated the killing efficiency of cascading, properly coordinated indirect fire. The story of how Allied forces transformed artillery from a support weapon into an offensive juggernaut began not in 1945, but 3 decades earlier, in the mud and blood of the Western Front. The rolling barrage, sometimes called a creeping barrage, emerged from the static horror of trench warfare as a solution to an impossible problem. How do you cross open ground under machine gun fire? How do you reach enemy trenches before defenders emerge from deep dugouts to man their weapons? The answer, British artillery officers discovered, was to move the artillery curtain forward in synchronized increments just ahead of advancing infantry. Instead of bombarding enemy positions and then lifting fire completely, allowing defenders time to recover, the barrage would advance in carefully timed lifts, 50 yards every 3 minutes, 100 yards every 5 minutes. The infantry would follow as closely as possible, staying within the FAV, protective shadow of exploding shells, arriving at enemy trenches while defenders remained suppressed. The Battle of the Somme in July 1916 saw the first large-scale employment of this technique. The results were mixed. Infantry struggled to maintain pace with the barrage. Communications failed. Guns fired at different rates. Men advancing too slowly found themselves exposed in no man's land. Those advancing too quickly walked into their own artillery fire. British casualties from friendly fire during early rolling barrages reached 10%, losses commanders grimly accepted as the price of tactical innovation. But the British persisted, refining the technique with each battle. At Vimy Ridge in April 1917, Canadian forces demonstrated the matured concept. Over 1,500 guns fired a precisely coordinated barrage that advanced in 100-yard increments. Artillery officers calculated exact firing tables. Forward observers positioned with infantry companies called corrections. Fire direction centers coordinated multiple batteries to ensure shells landed simultaneously at predetermined locations. The Canadians captured the ridge with remarkably low casualties, validating the rolling barrage as a tactical revolution. By November 1917, at Cambrai, the technique had evolved further. The British employed lifting barrages that moved in complex patterns, advancing forward, then sweeping back to catch defenders emerging from cover, then advancing again. Artillery and infantry worked as a single integrated system, with gunners adjusting fire based on coloured smoke shells fired by forward observers. The age of coordinated combined arms warfare had begun. When the guns finally fell silent on November 11, 1918, the rolling barrage had become standard British artillery doctrine. It represented more than just tactical evolution. It embodied a fundamental shift in how industrialized nations approached warfare. Victory belonged not to individual heroism, but to systematic organization, precise coordination, and the ability to mass firepower on demand. The Germans, despite their own artillery sophistication, had approached the problem differently. German doctrine emphasized flexibility and decentralized command. Battery commanders made independent decisions based on local conditions. Counter-battery fire received priority to neutralize enemy guns. Direct fire against identified targets took precedence over area suppression. This philosophy worked brilliantly in mobile warfare, allowing German forces to concentrate artillery rapidly at critical points. But against prepared defences requiring sustained suppressive fire, German methods proved less effective than British coordination. By 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, artillery doctrine had become one of the Wehrmacht's few relative weaknesses. German artillery pieces were excellent, gun crews well-trained, and forward observers aggressive. But the systematic coordination pioneered by the British during the Great War had not been fully adopted. German fire direction procedures remained more art than science, dependent on individual battery commanders rather than centralized control. This doctrinal gap widened during the 1940s. While the British refined their artillery coordination in North Africa, learning to mass fires from multiple regiments within minutes, the Germans focused on mobile warfare and close air support. The Luftwaffe became Germany's artillery, delivering devastating strikes that eliminated the need for massed gunfires. When German forces advanced, Stuka dive bombers cleared the path. Artillery followed behind, providing close support but rarely the overwhelming preparatory bombardments that characterized British operations. The turning point came in February 1943, when British artillery demonstrated its evolved capabilities at the Second Battle of El Alamein. Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery assembled over 400 guns along a 12,000-yard front. The initial barrage lasted hours, methodically destroying German defensive positions. When infantry finally advanced behind a creeping barrage, German survivors reported something unprecedented. Shells arriving from multiple directions simultaneously, creating interlocking kill zones that left no safe ground. German officers who survived Alamein filed reports describing British artillery as qualitatively different from earlier encounters. It was not simply the volume of fire, though that was overwhelming. It was the coordination. British forward observers, equipped with radio sets, directed fire from batteries miles away with deadly precision. Fire direction centers calculated firing solutions, accounting for weather, ammunition temperature, gun wear, and map coordinates to within yards. Multiple batteries fired time on target missions, shells arriving simultaneously to prevent any warning. These reports reached Wehrmacht High Command in Berlin, but their implications were not fully grasped. Germany in 1943 faced existential threats on multiple fronts. Soviet forces were grinding forward in the east. Anglo-American bombers hammered German cities. U-boats were failing in the Atlantic. Artillery doctrine seemed a secondary concern compared to strategic catastrophes unfolding across the Reich. The warnings about British fire coordination capabilities were filed away, noted but not acted upon. German defensive doctrine by mid-war emphasized depth over linear defense. Rather than holding a continuous front line, German forces established strongpoints supported by mobile reserves. When attacked, defenders would absorb the initial assault, then counterattack with armor and mechanized infantry. This approach worked devastatingly well against Soviet forces, whose artillery, while numerically superior, lacked British coordination. German defensive tactics assumed attackers would eventually pause to reorganize, creating opportunities for counterstrokes. Against British artillery, These assumptions proved catastrophic. A properly executed rolling barrage eliminated the pause. It provided continuous suppression, preventing defenders from emerging to resist. It walked forward inexorably, neutralizing strong points in sequence without giving reserves time to react. Most critically, it integrated seamlessly with infantry advance, ensuring attacking troops always had overhead fire support, something German defensive planning had not anticipated. By January 1945, the strategic situation had reached desperation for Germany. Soviet forces were advancing from the east toward Berlin. In the west, Anglo-American armies had recovered from the Ardennes offensive and stood poised to cross the Rhine into Germany proper. The Wehrmacht, bled white by years of attritional warfare, defended with whatever forces remained, old, men and teenagers of the Volkssturm, alongside exhausted veterans of the Eastern Front. Field Marshal Montgomery, commanding 21st Army Group, planned Operation Veritable to clear German forces from the Reichswald Forest and reach the Rhine. The operation would employ the largest British artillery concentration of the war, over 1,000 guns on a front barely 10 kilometers wide. Montgomery intended to demonstrate that systematic application of firepower could crush any defense, regardless of terrain or German tactical skill. The Reichswald itself seemed to favor the defenders. Dense pine forest, young trees planted in geometric rows, limited visibility, and channeled movement along narrow trails. Flooded ground to the south restricted maneuver. The Materborn Ridge provided commanding observation over the approaches. German engineers had fortified the forest with interlocking positions, minefields, and concrete bunkers. If defenders could hold long enough for reinforcements to arrive, the attack might be blunted. What German defenders did not know, could not have anticipated, was the scale and sophistication of the artillery support Montgomery had assembled. Beyond the 1,000 tubes of conventional artillery, an additional 850 weapons formed what the British called the pepper pot. Vickers machine guns, mortars, anti-aircraft guns, anti-tank guns, even tanks in stationary firing positions. Every weapon capable of indirect fire had been registered on pre-planned targets throughout the Reichswald. The preparation consumed weeks. Artillery officers surveyed every gun position to within inches. Meteorological teams released weather balloons to measure wind conditions at various altitudes. Ammunition stockpiles, over 500,000 shells weighing 11,000 tons, were positioned near firing batteries. Communication lines, 8,000 miles of various types of cable, connected forward observers with fire direction centers. Maps, 750,000 copies, ensured every soldier knew the plan. Most critically, the artillery fire plan integrated seamlessly with infantry maneuver. The barrage would begin at 5 hours on February 8th, overwhelming German forward positions. At 10:30, yellow smoke shells would signal the start of the rolling barrage, advancing at precisely calculated intervals. Infantry would follow 100 yards behind the exploding shells, reaching German positions while defenders remained suppressed. Timing was everything. Too fast, and defenders would have time to recover. Too slow, and attacking troops would be exposed to machine gun fire. Obergefreiter Dietrich, huddled in his position on the Materborn Ridge, knew none of this as darkness gave way to grey dawn on February 8th. He knew the British were coming. That much was obvious from the aircraft reconnaissance and the build-up of forces opposite his sector. His company commander had promised that German reserves, veteran paratroopers, would counterattack once the British committed. Hold the initial assault, they were told, and reinforcements would throw the enemy back. At exactly 5 hours, Dietrich's world ended. The barrage began not with individual shells, but as a continuous rolling thunder that merged into a single devastating roar. The ground beneath him heaved, trees shattered, hurling splinters through the air like shrapnel. The concrete bunker 30 yards to his right disintegrated under a direct hit from a heavy shell. Men were screaming, but Dietrich could not hear them over the explosive symphony that had transformed the forest into hell. The British artillery fired with mechanical precision. Every gun crew had been trained to load, aim, and fire in a continuous rhythm. Forward observers, positioned on high ground with clear views into the Reichswald, called corrections that fire direction centers immediately incorporated. Shells that fell short were noted, firing tables adjusted, and subsequent rounds landed precisely on target. The barrage was not random, it was mathematical, each shell contributing to a calculated pattern of destruction. For 90 minutes, the bombardment continued without pause. German telephone lines, buried but not deep enough, were severed. Radio communications jammed by interference from thousands of explosions. Company commanders lost contact with their platoons. Battalion headquarters could not reach forward positions. The Wehrmacht's carefully constructed defensive system, predicated on flexible response and rapid communication, had been decapitated before the attack even began. At 10:29, yellow smoke shells burst above the German forward positions, signaling the next phase. The barrage, which had been falling on fixed targets, suddenly began to move. It lifted from the first line of German defences and advanced 100 yards deeper into the forest. 3 minutes later, it lifted again, walking forward at a steady, inexorable pace toward the second line of German positions. Behind this wall of fire, British and Canadian infantry emerged from their assembly areas. Scottish regiments of the 15th Division, Welsh battalions of the 53rd, Canadian brigades of the 1st Army, all moving forward in carefully rehearsed coordination. Tank support followed, Churchill heavy tanks grinding through mud and over obstacles. The attacking forces kept formation, maintaining distance behind the barrage, trusting in the precision that had been drilled into them during weeks of training. Dietrich emerged from his position as the barrage moved past, ears bleeding, vision blurred. Around him, survivors stumbled through smoke and dust, trying to locate their weapons, their comrades, any semblance of organized defense. That's when he saw them, shadowy figures moving through the smoke barely 100 yards away. British infantry, advancing in extended lines, rifles ready. Before Dietrich could raise his weapon, the barrage lifted again, and shells began falling directly on his position. The rolling barrage continued its methodical advance throughout the morning. Every 100 yards, every 3 to 5 minutes, the curtain of fire moved forward. German positions that had survived the initial bombardment found themselves under direct fire from shells that seemed to appear from nowhere. Strong points held by determined defenders were suppressed, bypassed, then eliminated as the barrage swept back across them, in a technique the British called combing. By noon, the 15th Scottish Division had achieved all its initial objectives, albeit 2 hours behind schedule due to muddy conditions that slowed both armour and infantry. But they had advanced over 2 miles into German defences, captured hundreds of prisoners, and suffered remarkably light casualties. The rolling barrage had functioned exactly as planned, suppressing German resistance so effectively that many defenders surrendered, without firing a shot. The German 84th Infantry Division, defending the Reichswald's northern sector, was shattered. Of 6 battalions holding the forward positions, 3 had ceased to exist as coherent units. The survivors fell back in disarray, unable to maintain any defensive line. German officers attempting to organize counterattacks found their men too shell-shocked to respond effectively. One captured German battalion commander told his interrogators that he had never experienced anything like it. The British artillery had simply erased his unit from existence. What made the barrage so devastating was not any single element, but the integration of multiple components into a seamless system. Forward observers positioned with every infantry company provided real-time targeting information. Fire direction centers calculated firing solutions within seconds. Radio communications allowed immediate coordination across multiple artillery regiments. Survey techniques ensured every gun knew its exact position relative to target coordinates. Meteorological data accounted for environmental factors affecting shell trajectories. The result was artillery fire that functioned less like a weapon and more like an industrial process. Targets were identified, coordinates calculated, fire missions assigned, and shells delivered with assembly line efficiency. The Wehrmacht, despite its tactical sophistication in mobile warfare, had no answer to this systematic application of firepower. German defensive doctrine assumed artillery would fire on identified targets, creating gaps that defenders could exploit. Against a rolling barrage that advanced on a timetable regardless of enemy action, those gaps never materialized. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By the evening of February 8th, British and Canadian forces had penetrated 3 miles into the Reichswald, captured over 1,100 prisoners, and inflicted over 3,000 casualties on defending German forces. Their own losses, 300, and 49 killed and wounded, represented a casualty exchange ratio unprecedented in Western Front fighting. The rolling barrage had achieved what traditional assaults could not, breaking through prepared German defences with acceptable losses. The following days would see continued bitter fighting as German reserves, including elite paratrooper formations, counterattacked desperately. But the pattern established on the first day would repeat throughout Operation Veritable. British artillery would methodically suppress German positions. Infantry would advance behind the protective curtain of fire. German counterattacks would be shattered by concentrated artillery fire before reaching British lines. The Wehrmacht's tactical flexibility proved useless against an enemy that could mass artillery fire anywhere on the battlefield within minutes. At the village of Heckens, on February 11th, German paratroopers held fortified positions that stopped the 5th Seaforth Highlanders. Cold. The Highlanders took cover in shallow ditches, pinned down by machine gun fire for most of the day. Rather than accept heavy casualties in a frontal assault, British commanders simply called for artillery. The barrage that followed was brief but devastating. When it lifted, the Highlanders advanced into Heckens and found bewildered Germans stumbling out of their shelters. Over 300 surrendered without resistance. This became the template for the entire operation. Whenever German resistance stiffened, British forces would pause, call for artillery support, and wait for the guns to do their work. The rolling barrage technique had evolved beyond its Great War origins. Now it could be initiated on demand, tailored to specific tactical situations, and delivered with precision that minimized friendly fire while maximizing enemy casualties. The Wehrmacht faced an enemy that had industrialized warfare to a degree German forces could no longer match. German General Alfred Schlemm, commanding 1st Parachute Army, defending the Reichswald sector, filed reports documenting the catastrophic impact of British artillery. His positions had been surveyed from the air. Every strong point, every approach route, every potential assembly area had been pre-registered as an artillery target. When his forces attempted to move, shells arrived within minutes. When they remained stationary, the rolling barrage eventually reached them. There was no safe ground, no opportunity for the mobile defense that German doctrine prescribed. Most troubling for Schlemm was the realization that German artillery could not provide effective counter-battery fire. British guns fired from positions miles behind the front line, beyond the range of German counterfire. Even when German artillery managed to identify British gun positions, the volume of shells German batteries could deliver paled compared to British firepower. German gunners expended their limited ammunition attacking individual targets, while British artillery systematically destroyed entire sectors of the German defensive zone. The ammunition disparity told the story in stark terms. British forces had stockpiled over 500,000 shells for Operation Veritable, with additional supplies readily available from depots in Belgium and the Netherlands. German forces defending the Reichswald relied on ammunition that had to be transported by truck and horse-drawn wagon through a logistics system under constant Allied air attack. By mid-February, German artillery batteries were rationing shells, firing only at the most critical targets, while British guns could fire preparatory bombardments lasting hours. The rolling barrage demonstrated another advantage that German planners had not anticipated. It functioned regardless of visibility. In the smoke and dust of battle, or during night operations, German defenders could not see attacking infantry until they were within grenade range. But British infantry could follow the barrage by sound and timing. advancing blindly with confidence that the curtain of fire ahead of them was suppressing enemy positions. Several German strongpoints reported that they first became aware of British infantry only when they were already inside their perimeter. The psychological impact on German defenders equaled the physical destruction. Men who survived one barrage knew another was coming. There was no respite, no opportunity to rest or recover. Every few hours, the earth would begin to shake, shells would rain down, and those who emerged from their dugouts would face attacking infantry. German soldiers, even elite paratroopers, began surrendering in large numbers rather than endure the mechanical destruction that artillery represented. Captured German soldiers, interviewed by British intelligence officers, consistently described the artillery as the most terrifying aspect of combat. Machine gun fire could be evaded, mortars could be predicted by sound, but the rolling barrage gave no warning, offered no chance of escape, and continued regardless of how bravely defenders fought. One German sergeant told his captors that facing British artillery made him feel helpless, like a target in a shooting gallery waiting for the inevitable shot. Operation Veritable continued throughout February and into early March, finally achieving its objectives on March 10th, when British and Canadian forces reached the Rhine. The campaign consumed 30 days of continuous fighting, cost the Allies over 15,000 casualties, and inflicted over 90,000 casualties on defending German forces, including over 50,000 prisoners. The disparity in losses reflected the advantage that systematic artillery coordination provided. The campaign also revealed the extent to which German defensive capabilities had eroded by early 1945. Units defending the Reichswald included veterans of the Eastern Front, mixed with Volkssturm, conscripts, boys and old men with minimal training. Equipment shortages meant that many positions lacked adequate ammunition, anti-tank weapons, or communication equipment. But even when German forces possessed the materiel and training to resist effectively, British artillery proved overwhelming. At the tactical level, Operation Veritable demonstrated principles that would influence military doctrine for decades. The integration of forward observers, fire direction centers, and massed artillery created a weapons system more powerful than the sum of its parts. The rolling barrage technique, refined over 30 years of development, provided infantry with reliable fire support that suppressed enemy defenses without requiring precise target identification. The coordination achieved by British forces in 1945 represented the apex of pre-computer artillery command and control. The question that haunted German military analysts after the war was simple. Why had the Wehrmacht failed to anticipate the devastating effectiveness of Allied artillery coordination? The answer lay not in technical deficiency, but in strategic myopia shaped by years of mobile warfare success. German forces had won stunning victories in Poland, France, and the early stages of the Russian campaign through rapid maneuver, combined arms coordination, and tactical flexibility. Artillery played a supporting role, but victory came from movement, not firepower. This success bred institutional blindness to alternative approaches. While British forces refined their artillery doctrine through years of defensive fighting in North Africa and Italy, learning to mass fires and coordinate barrages with precision, German forces focused on mobility and counterattack. The concept of systematically suppressing enemy defenses with overwhelming artillery seemed wasteful to German commanders accustomed to fluid battlefield conditions where gun positions had to displace frequently. Moreover, Germany's strategic situation after 1943 left little opportunity for doctrinal adaptation. The Wehrmacht faced simultaneous multi-front warfare against enemies with superior industrial capacity. Resources that might have gone to artillery ammunition instead went to tanks, aircraft, and fuel for mobile operations. German artillery doctrine emphasized quality over quantity, precision over volume, flexibility over systematic coordination. These were sound principles for an army conducting mobile defense with limited resources, but they proved inadequate against an enemy that could afford to fire 500,000 shells in a single operation. The human cost of this doctrinal gap was staggering. During Operation Veritable alone, over 22,000 German soldiers were killed or wounded by Allied artillery fire. Many never saw the enemy infantry they were defending against. They died in their positions, torn apart by shells fired from guns they could neither see nor effectively counter. The industrial efficiency of British artillery coordination had transformed warfare into something approaching mechanical slaughter, where individual courage and tactical skill mattered less than systematic application of firepower. Obergefreiter Dietrich survived the first day of the Reichswald battle, but barely. He was captured on February 10th when British infantry overran what remained of his company's position. In prisoner of war interrogation, he described the experience of facing the rolling barrage in terms that captured the psychological horror of industrialized warfare. "You could not fight it," he told his interrogators. "You could only hide and hope the next shell would not land on you. We were not soldiers anymore. We were targets." This transformation, from soldier to target, represented the final evolution of artillery warfare that had begun in the trenches of the Great War. The rolling barrage technique had matured from a dangerous innovation that killed friendly troops to a precision instrument that could walk through enemy defenses with mathematical certainty. The 30 years between the Somme and the Reichswald had seen the perfection of indirect fire coordination, and that perfection made traditional defensive tactics obsolete. The implications extended beyond Operation Veritable. Throughout the final months of the war, as Allied forces advanced into Germany, the pattern repeated. At Operation Plunder in March 1945, Montgomery assembled over 4,000 guns for the Rhine crossing. The bombardment lasted 4 hours and consumed more ammunition than entire campaigns had expended in previous wars. German defenders facing this onslaught had no tactical answer. They could surrender, or they could die in their positions. Resistance, no matter how determined, merely delayed the inevitable. The crossing of the Rhine demonstrated another dimension of Allied artillery superiority, the ability to rapidly shift fires across the battlefield. As British and Canadian forces secured bridgeheads on the Rhine's eastern bank, German counterattacks attempted to throw them back into the river. Every counterattack was met with concentrated artillery fire that destroyed German formations before they could reach Allied positions. Fire direction centers coordinated batteries to create killing zones that German troops could not cross. The flexibility that had characterized German tactical doctrine now belonged to their enemies. By April 1945, the Wehrmacht in the West had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. The Ruhr Pocket, where over 300,000 German soldiers surrendered, demonstrated the final collapse. American and British forces encircled German Army Group B, then systematically reduced the pocket with artillery fire and infantry assault. German soldiers surrendered in thousands, many citing the hopelessness of facing Allied artillery as their primary reason for capitulation. The commander of Army Group B, Field Marshal Walter Model, committed suicide on April 21st, rather than order his men to continue fighting against impossible odds. Model had been one of Germany's most capable defensive commanders, earning the nickname the Führer's Fireman for his skill at stabilizing collapsing fronts. But even he recognized that German defensive doctrine had no answer to Allied material superiority, particularly in artillery. In his final message to his staff, Model acknowledged that further resistance would only result in pointless casualties without affecting the war's outcome. The broader strategic narrative of 1945 confirmed what Operation Veritable had demonstrated at the tactical level. Germany had lost the industrial war of attrition. While German weapons systems, from Tiger tanks to Me-262 jets, often surpassed Allied equivalents in technical sophistication, they existed in insufficient numbers to matter. Allied forces could afford to fire thousands of artillery shells to destroy a single strongpoint because they had millions more shells in reserve. Germany could not match this expenditure and maintain operations across multiple fronts. The rolling barrage exemplified this industrial approach to warfare. It was not elegant or particularly innovative by 1945. It was simply effective, a methodical application of overwhelming firepower that ground down enemy resistance through sheer volume and coordination. The British had transformed artillery from an art requiring skilled gunners making individual decisions to a science executed by trained technicians following standardized procedures. This transformation, more than any specific tactical innovation, marked the difference between victory and defeat. For German veterans who survived the war, the memory of Allied artillery remained traumatic decades later. Interviews conducted in the 1970s and 80s with survivors of Reichswald battle consistently describe the barrage as the most terrifying experience of their military service, worse than house-to-house fighting, worse than tank battles, worse than aerial bombardment. The systematic, impersonal nature of artillery fire left psychological scars that never fully healed. Men who had faced enemy infantry with courage found themselves helpless against an enemy they could not see, could not fight, could only endure. The technical lessons of the rolling barrage influenced post-war military development across multiple domains. The coordination techniques pioneered by British artillery officers became standard doctrine in NATO forces. Forward observer training emphasized radio communication and rapid target identification. Fire direction centers evolved into computer-assisted systems that could coordinate fires from dozens of batteries automatically. The principle of massing artillery fire at decisive points remained central to military planning and throughout the Cold War. But the human lessons were more ambiguous. The rolling barrage's effectiveness came from its ability to suppress and destroy, without requiring individual soldiers to close with the enemy. This made warfare more survivable for attackers, but potentially more brutal for defenders, who faced mechanical destruction against which courage offered no protection. The industrialization of warfare, which the rolling barrage epitomized, raised questions about the nature of combat that military theorists continue debating today. The contrast between German and Allied artillery doctrine in 1945 illustrated broader patterns in how nations approach warfare. Germany emphasized tactical excellence, unit initiative, and operational flexibility. These qualities served brilliantly in mobile warfare, where superior training and leadership could offset numerical disadvantages. Britain emphasized systematic coordination, standardized procedures, and overwhelming material superiority. These qualities served brilliantly in attritional warfare, where industrial capacity determined outcomes. Neither approach was inherently superior. In different circumstances, German tactical flexibility might have prevailed, but by 1945, circumstances favored systematic application of firepower over tactical brilliance. The Wehrmacht could not maneuver when Allied artillery could blanket any concentration of forces with shells within minutes. German counterattacks could not succeed when British forward observers could call down artillery fire that arrived faster than German troops could advance. The final accounting of Operation Veritable and similar battles in early 1945 revealed the stark mathematics of industrial warfare. Allied forces fired millions of artillery shells into Germany during the war's final months. German forces, operating with constrained ammunition supplies and disrupted logistics, could not respond in kind. The result was a casualty exchange ratio that heavily favored the Allies despite Germany's defensive advantages. Superior firepower coordination trumped defensive preparation, tactical skill, and even favorable terrain. For those German soldiers who lived through the rolling barrages of 1945, the experience shattered any remaining illusions about the war's outcome. When an enemy could summon thousands of shells to obliterate a single position, when artillery fire arrived with such coordination that escape was impossible, when the very ground itself became a killing zone from which there was no refuge, further resistance seemed pointless. Many German soldiers chose surrender over facing another barrage, a rational decision that German officers could neither prevent nor effectively punish. The Wehrmacht's failure to adequately prepare for Allied artillery coordination stemmed ultimately from strategic circumstances beyond any commander's control. By the time British forces perfected their rolling barrage techniques, Germany lacked the industrial capacity, trained personnel, and ammunition stockpiles necessary to implement similar systems. Even had German commanders recognized the threat earlier, they could not have matched Allied firepower while simultaneously defending on multiple fronts against enemies with overwhelming material superiority. In this sense, the rolling barrage represented not just a tactical technique, but a manifestation of industrial power. Nations that could produce millions of shells, train thousands of artillery crews, manufacture hundreds of radio sets, and develop sophisticated fire direction procedures possessed military capabilities that traditional martial virtues could not overcome. The Wehrmacht's tactical excellence, which had dominated European battlefields from 1939 through 1942, proved insufficient against systematic application of firepower backed by unlimited material resources. The legacy of the rolling barrage extends beyond its immediate tactical impact. It demonstrated that modern warfare had become fundamentally industrial, that victory belonged to nations that could mobilize their economies for total war, and that traditional military virtues like courage, discipline, and tactical skill, while still important, had become subordinate to organizational efficiency and material superiority. This lesson, learned painfully by German forces in 1945, would shape military thinking throughout the remainder of the 20th century. Standing among the ruins of the Reichswald Forest in the spring of 1945, with shattered trees and shell craters marking where the rolling barrage had passed, observers could see the future of warfare written in the devastation. The age of heroic charges and tactical brilliance was ending. The age of systematic firepower coordination and industrial warfare had arrived. The Wehrmacht, despite its tactical sophistication and fighting spirit, had been ground down by an enemy that approached war as an industrial process to be optimized, rather than a contest of martial valor to be won through courage. The final irony was that German forces had helped pioneer this approach to warfare through their own innovations in combined arms coordination and systematic training. But when faced with an enemy that took these principles to their logical conclusion, applying overwhelming firepower through methodical coordination, the Wehrmacht discovered that tactical excellence alone could not overcome material disadvantage. The rolling barrage, walking forward yard by yard through German defences, destroying positions with mechanical inevitability, proved this truth more effectively than any strategic analysis. For the young men of both sides who experienced the Reichswald battle, the lessons were more personal. War was not glorious. Courage did not guarantee survival. Industrial firepower could reduce human beings to statistics in a casualty report. The rolling barrage, for all its tactical effectiveness, represented warfare stripped of individual agency, where soldiers became targets in a mechanical process of destruction. This was the face of 20th century warfare, efficient, terrible, and ultimately impersonal. The techniques pioneered in the Reichswald Forest continued to evolve. In Korea, American forces used similar rolling barrages against Chinese human wave attacks. In Vietnam, artillery fire coordination reached new levels of precision with computer assistance. In the Gulf War, GPS-guided munitions allowed single shells to accomplish what had required thousands in 1945. But the fundamental principle remained unchanged. Properly coordinated indirect fire could suppress and destroy enemy forces with an efficiency that made traditional defensive tactics obsolete. The story of the rolling barrage is ultimately the story of how warfare transformed from an art to a science, from individual heroism to systematic coordination, from tactical brilliance to industrial efficiency. The Wehrmacht, despite its martial tradition and tactical excellence, could not adapt quickly enough to this transformation. The cost of that failure was measured in the lives of hundreds of thousands of German soldiers who died facing an enemy that had industrialized death itself. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.